Okay, gentlemen, Monday, May 10th is the big day. As you already know, we're launching our brand new clubhouse room, Dogs and Cats Living Together, Dating and Relating for Men and Women Who Actually Like Each Other. My co-host is none other than Cindy Olin. She's bringing her group of like-minded women to the party here. We're going to discuss all things dating and relating, have a lot of fun doing it. Monday, May 10th at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. That's 5:30 p.m. Pacific. If you do not yet have an invite to Clubhouse, you can get one or just join the club in general by going to mountaintoppodcast.com/clubhouse. And now, here comes big milestone episode number 250 with my brand new friend Scott Yenor from Boise State University. Batten down the hatches. This is not only going to be a thought-provoking episode, it's going to be a controversial one for many as well. Here we go.
Live from the mist-enshrouded mountaintop fortress that is X and Y Communications headquarters, you're listening to the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. And now, here's your host, Scott McKay.
Howdy, gentlemen. Welcome again to yet another episode of the world-famous Mountaintop Podcast. My name is Scott McKay, at Scott McKay on both Twitter and Clubhouse. You can find us on Instagram at Real Scott McKay, Scott McKay on YouTube. The URL where all things Mountaintop Podcast can be found is mountaintoppodcast.com. And you can also join our Facebook group, which I hope you will, at the Mountaintop Summit on Facebook. With me today is a new friend of mine. He's a great guy, and he's going to cover with you and I a topic that I've been, kind of jonesing to cover here for darn near a year now, ever since it came up briefly on another episode. And I discovered this guy's work in all places, the Tucker Carlson show during prime time. There he was talking to Tucker Carlson about what he calls family pressure. And my interest was piqued immediately. He's the author of a book called The Recovery of Family Life, Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideologies. He's a pretty smart guy. As a matter of fact, he's a professor of political science over at Boise State University, home of the blue football field, by the way. Washington Fellow of the Claremont Institute as well. And the main focus of his work is indeed on the family in political thoughts. Without anything further, Scott Yenor, welcome to the show, man.
Thanks for having me on, Scott. I appreciate it.
Yeah, if you are giving most of your thought in your work, not all of it, of course. I mean, professors are always multifaceted. That's what people with brains do in this life, is they think about a lot of different things. But if the main focus of your work is indeed the family and political thought, and you're talking about something called family pressure, then I would love to just have you riff on basically what that idea entails. What is it we're talking about here? Let's wrap our heads around it.
Yeah, I mean, my argument is that there are just some powerful ideologies that are out there in the world that are prominent in our political environment, and they're hostile to the formation of solid relationships between men and women, enduring relationships between men and women, and also hostile to having children. And these powerful ideologies I identify as three. One is modern feminism. The second is contemporary liberalism. And the third is sexual liberation theory. And each of these ideologies has an idea of where it wants to take individuals and what those individuals should look like. Feminism wants to take society itself beyond the idea of gender, as it calls it, and really imagines an androgynous future for all people where we wouldn't even recognize men and women and they wouldn't have any different kinds of characters. Sexual liberation theory wants to take men and women beyond what they call repression, so that people will be sexually expressive and practice all kinds of sexual preferences over the course of their lives. And the purpose of these ideologies is to really point people away from family life, so that they think of themselves really only as individuals, so that they inflate the importance of sex in their lives, and they won't have children, and they won't bear heavy responsibilities that belong to family life. So, and these ideologies are really powerful all over the world, but they're especially powerful here in America. And that has really led to some implications like fewer babies being born, fewer marriages being established. There's even kind of a sex recession, as I understand. That is, there's more people who are having a lot less sex than they used to, both married and unmarried. And these are the logical outgrowths of these really powerful ideologies that are dominating our political life.
Now, that's all very important, and I'm sure everybody's interest is already piqued, especially since I've been known to talk about some of the issues you've already mentioned, and I've indeed been criticized publicly for it, by the way. This is a very polarizing set of views you're talking about. But to a lot of people, it just seems kind of obvious that this has been going on. I mean, on one hand, hey, we're all being told that we need to affect these changes and that it's important to society at large for some reason. But on the other hand, when we ask why, we're rebuffed and called all sorts of names for even challenging it. So why don't I ask you, since you're here and you're apparently open-minded to answering all these questions on this topic, Scott, what's your opinion on why these issues and these changes in particular are so important to enact to what you're calling the political realm?
Yeah, I mean, these are really crucial ideologies of, I would say, the American ruling elite. The American ruling elite is really committed to the idea that there shouldn't be differences between men and women, and they stigmatize, people who say that there are differences and that those differences lead to, great things in human life like fruitful relationships and complementary relationships, and even sometimes men and women arranging their lives so that they lose their own individual identities. These ideologies are hostile to deep, abiding love between men and women. And, I think the reason they're so crucial to to modern ruling elite is that we've bought into some of these principles of modern life, like individualism, that celebrate our individual expression or celebrate our individual successes or celebrate our individuals pursuing their own interest at the expense of these other deep and meaningful human experiences that happen only between a man and a woman and the children that they produce. So, it's a little bit sewn into the nature of America. We always have emphasized individual rights, but we used to qualify or compromise our commitment to individual rights with a recognition that forming enduring bonds between men and women is what makes life worth living, or one of the things that makes life worth living. And it allows us to pursue happiness and achieve a lot of happiness and fulfillment in life. But when we stop compromising our commitment to individual rights and individual lives, we, end up being more free, but less happy. And that's really one of the great paradoxes, I think, of our time, is that we're freer than we've ever been, but we're also less happy.
Now, that strikes me as a paradox indeed, because as you were talking, I was thinking this idea of us losing our individuality and becoming more uniform in so many ways sounds a lot like Chairman Mao's Great Society. I mean, we're all going to wear white shirts, black slacks, and do the same things, believe the same things, talk the same way, look the same way. And you had a lot of people trying to flee that culture to come to places like America, where we had freer expression. So to hear you say something like, hey, the more freedom we enjoy, the less happy we tend to be, sounds a lot like people having the freedom to not realize how good we have it. In other words, because I have freedom of thought, freedom of speech, I'm going to bitch and complain about everything, even though I have the freedom to do what I want, enjoy the hobbies I want, dress the way I want, color my hair the way I want, etc. So it is indeed a paradox on many levels. First of all, socially, second of all, politically, and even kind of descends almost to the human soul level, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's in some ways the freedom that we have is a question. So feminism promises, for instance, that women will be free to choose whatever they would like in their world. They can choose a career, they can choose a path of motherhood, they can become nuns. People are supposed to be able to pursue, be free to become whatever that they want to be. But, on the other hand, feminism really has an idea of what a woman should choose. That really women should choose to honor their career over their marriage and over motherhood. And we spend a lot of time preparing young girls to do exactly that. So, I think there's always an ideal, a social ideal, something that we honor, a kind of man or a kind of woman that we as a society honor. And we honor a particular kind of woman today. She's athletic, she's more independent, she's career-oriented, And the paradox, or the way I think this runs into human life for us, is that particular life course isn't what like 3 out of 4 women want. But nevertheless, many of them are really caught in the grip of the social pressure and the social ideal to pursue that kind of life. So I think in some ways, the freedom that we are sold is a little bit of a disguise, and that we have social ideals. And those social ideals that we have are what really compromise our ability to be happy.
Such an interesting point. You know, my wife Emily and I, about a year ago, had this very discussion. They were talking about the economy of the United States and how, although ostensibly it seemed to be going well, there were fewer women in the workforce, which, oh my goodness, was such a red flag. And my wife, who, in case you haven't guessed yet, is female, is a woman, right? So this is a first-person assessment on her part. She's like, wait a minute, what if the better economy allowed more women to stay home and be moms and raise their kids and not be in the workforce? And I'm like, yeah, what a concept, as if that wasn't even an option, according to these people who are gauging our economy on these different metrics, right?
Yeah, no, I totally agree with that. You know, it's kind of an interesting thing that as societies become more prosperous, really what it does is it allows more women to actually choose out of the career rat race. So what you have, especially in the upper class in America, is actually very few women who, when they have children under the age of 18, are working full-time in the upper classes because they can afford it. And when they can afford it, they can actually start pursuing the things that are most important to them. And it's harder for people down the economic ladder to do that. And that's one of the things that I try to do in the book, is just say, like, this is something we as a society should try to prioritize. Many women want to have more children than they do have. Many women want to spend more time with their children than they're allowed to or than they have time to. And one of the ways we can try to ease that burden is to allow or honor part-time work instead of full-time work, motherhood instead of careerism. So yeah, I mean, feminism claims to be about choice as long as people choose the way they want to. And the problem is that most women don't want to choose the way feminists want them to choose.
Well, that seems to sum up politics in general nowadays. Your freedom to think whatever you want. The First Amendment is still there as long as you agree with me. If not, well, you know, we got to somehow either re-educate you or flat out cancel you, right?
Yeah, I mean, these ideologies of feminism and sexual liberation especially, I mean, they're part of a larger, collection of ideologies, that I think make up the modern left or America's ruling elite. And, I'm really concerned about the effects of those on family life. I'm also really concerned about the effects of those powerful ideologies on our modern universities. I think there's, great ways in which universities and their mission has been compromised because of their commitment to these powerful ideologies. But, one of the easiest ways to see the power of these ideologies is in the falling birth rates all across the Western world. I mean, feminism says that women should be independent of the family, independent of men, independent of their children. And the best way to actually accomplish such independence is never to have children. And the birth rates in every country in the Western world, every country really where feminism has sunk its roots deeply, are way under replacement rates. In some countries, it's under 1. In America, it looks to be about 1.6, 1.7 births per woman. And only one country, Israel, has a birth rate above replacement. The replacement rate is 2.1 children per woman. So, I think this ideology has a easily measured effect when we look at birth rates. And so it's one way in which I can contribute to showing how the modern ideologies are having a real life effect on the ground. Feminism compromises birth rates, period.
That's really an interesting thought, and it's one that I ruminate upon constantly. Because if you look at a nation like Japan, they're sounding the alarm over there, Scott. It's like, hey, y'all need to, meet, procreate, get laid a little bit, and make some babies because we don't have any new ones coming, and Japan's going to cease to have any population unless you get started with this and get going. And yet, you know, you have the otaku culture over there where guys have become technical nerds. They have a whole cultural surround for that lifestyle for men relative to being men who are attractive to women. And nobody's getting together. They're almost saying, hey, we're better off not doing it. So on one hand, they're kind of like playing this sort of kayfabe charade where it's like, oh my goodness, we really wish that the birth rate would go higher because this is so dangerous to our culture. And yet, out of the other side of their mouth, this social pressure is actively lowering the birth rate. And I've been trying to wrap my head around that for quite some time. All the things you talked about in terms of trying to make us a little bit more uniform, to kind of keep us from doing those things which we want to do, sound a lot like mind control. You know, we're all going to be more alike. We're going to just say no to gender identity, gender roles, nuclear family stuff. Is that what's going on here? Is it about the so-called liberal elites being in control and being able to manipulate the people who are their constituents?
Yeah, I mean, I think partly, you know, let's think of it like this. You know, there are a lot of things that we used to take for granted. And, you know, and I think some of the work that you do on this podcast, Scott, is really about some of these things that we used to take for granted. For instance, we used to take for granted that men and women would be interested in one another and want to get together, not only for physical contact, that is having sex, but also they would marry, that they would want to marry. And that we really thought that if we could remove all of the cultural props that led people toward marriage, that led them to want to be with one another, that they still would want to be with one another, and that they still would want to marry, and that they still would want to have children. We used to have a lot of cultural supports that led people, that helped them do these things. We've removed those cultural supports. And now what are we finding? And I think East Asia is a great example of this. We're finding that actually we can't take these things for granted. We cannot take these things for granted. That is, men and women will not simply be interested in one another. They need to be in a certain kind of lane of manliness and femaleness in order to be interested in one another. They won't necessarily marry. They have to have reasons to marry. And that even if they have sex, they won't necessarily have children. These things can all be stopped now. So the great cultural project of bringing men and women together in marriage and to have children has been kind of dismantled. And it's been dismantled, I think, in the name of individual freedom, maybe in the name of some sort of high ideals. Maybe we took for granted that these things would just continue on through a kind of inertia. But we're learning that it doesn't continue on through a kind of inertia. And that's why I think some of the things that you do in your podcast here and on your website are important, because you're actually trying to, in many cases, teach people the manners and mores about why they should want to be together and how to bring them, you know, how to make something together. And because we can't take it for granted anymore.
Yeah, well, obviously I agree with you. It's sort of my life purpose, right? But thank you for your kind words. You know, as you're talking, a lot of times I think people think of this whole idea of, I don't know what overarching title you would give it, but it's, to me, kind of a three-legged stool. Okay, you have sex, sexual attraction, family, marriage, parenting, etc., and then procreation, which is furthering the human race. And I think we see those things as a monolith, and perhaps we shouldn't. But I will agree with you that there is definitely a pressure being placed not only on the family unit, but also on sexual attraction and on making babies. Now, it's time for me, I guess, to throw my grand and, in my opinion, fun conspiracy theory on the table here just to see what you think. First of all, they can try to keep men and women from being horny for each other, but they're fighting a tsunami that is perhaps the greatest force in the universe, which is sex. People are just not going to stop screwing, Scott. We're so horny, okay? I mean, trying to stop people from having sex, I mean, you can try, you can use all kinds of mind control and threats of eternal damnation and being ostracized from the community all you want, but all of us know from Catholic school, we're all going to still screw each other's brains out anyway. So there's the first one. Second one is this whole idea that, the family is irrelevant anymore. You know, it started with Hillary Clinton, at least blatantly so, writing a book saying, it takes a village to raise a child. I mean, there was the first blatant admission that, hey, you know what? As a family, you don't matter. Now you have the BLM folks saying, hey, you know what? Black dads don't matter. The family unit doesn't matter. It's become almost mainstream popular thinking, and it's what all the cool kids think, that, hey, you know what? If you're a family unit, you're old school, you're probably some sort of Republican, and you're repressive and probably racist and terrorist too. God help you, you know. And then the third thing that comes up is this whole idea of making babies. Now, here's what I think. I think, first of all, we're overpopulated on this planet, and I have this sneaking suspicion they've already figured out how to dramatically slow the aging process or perhaps stop it. And I think the elites already know this. It's coming. And what are we going to do if people keep living, and only accidents kill them or whatever? As technology increases, people are going to live longer at the very least. And we just got to stop babies from being born. The rest of it is just for show. Oh my gosh, the falling birth rate, whatever are we going to do? Wherever shall we go? Like I said, it's all kayfabe. The reality is we need fewer babies. At least that's what I think. I'm going to go ahead and let you riff on that before we get into the intricacies of some of the ways reproduction and family is pressured. But I'd love to hear your thoughts on all that crazy stuff I just spat out.
Well, yeah. So let's talk about the first and the third thing. First, will sex continue? Now, I'm inclined to think that human beings will still want to have sex with one another. But I think that we can underestimate the extent to which sex with actual others requires manners, mores, a kind of resistance from one to the other in order to encourage it to happen. There was a recent study out by the Institute for Family Studies that suggested that a historic high number of people have not had sex over the last year. And the number, I think, is 25% of the population in the United States. It's different for men and women. It's a little higher for men than it is for women. In some of these East Asian countries, the sexless rate is even higher. It seems like it's about 40% for men. And you know, people are starting to write about this particular problem of involuntary celibacy. A lot of men are more interested in pornography than they are in actual women. There's now like a little side industry of sex robots that's available. So I think it's true that people will always be interested in sex to some ways, but that doesn't mean that they're going to be interested in one another. And I think that's, you know, something we've taken for granted, but that we probably need to, you know, encourage people to want to be with one another in ways that we used to, I would say, as I say before, take for granted. Now, the second thing, you know, I haven't seen all the genetic stuff that you're talking about, and here's what I would say about it, though. My impression is that life expectancy is going to go up, but that it's not going to be matched with an increase in human productivity in the ages, I would say, after 80. That is, I think they have found ways to slow the aging process already. People are living longer lives. People who survive to age 20 are probably going to live almost to age 90 now. And we'll probably make that a little higher. But that doesn't mean that those late years are going to be greatly productive. And in fact, the long-term problem is that there's going to be too few workers to sustain too many people who are on, government programs for old people all across the Western world. So the birth dearth, as it's called, the decline in birth rates, is really going to compromise all of the welfare approaches that we have now, because there's just going to be too few workers to sustain way too many people who aren't productive in their old age. So there's a real need for people. And the way the Western world has been, reacting to it is to import new populations, import young populations in order to be the workers that will sustain their welfare states. And that causes a whole host of other problems that, are not exactly in my lane. But that's one way that they've approached the problem of birth rates. So I think that we shouldn't overestimate the extent to which civilization really always will depend on rejuvenating itself through the arrival of the new generation.
Man, there's a whole season of podcasts we could record on this. It's one juicy, total standalone topic after another. You know, my kids were watching the Pixar movie WALL-E the other night. They'd never watched it before. And it's the first time since it came out I had seen it. I can't believe it's already 12 years old. But you watch this movie and you realize, oh my God, this was so prescient. People are sitting around in front of their smart screens, getting fatter and doing nothing. And depending on some robot or some other, automated system to do this for them. And you briefly and perhaps just barely skirted upon this idea of us importing a whole new generation of people to do the dirty work for us. Cough immigration, illegal immigration, right? And yet, I mean, how can that be sustainable too? So I guess what you're trying to say is all this is going to ultimately backfire on the people who thought this was some sort of grand new world design that was going to save us all, especially those who are in a position of authority or political power. I think everybody with a brain in their head already realizes that this is about the people in powerful positions getting more powerful. And although we do have a racism problem, although we have people not being tolerant of one another, and we all could do better in that regard, all of that is conveniently talked about at length to the exclusion of how people who are richer are getting more powerful, and they're the ones pulling the strings. And yet, here we are back talking about family, the family unit, family pressure. And just to kind of let you know, one of the things you said when we were chatting before we started is you and I might not agree on everything. So far, I'm right with you, Scott. I mean, you've said everything that I completely agree with. I just think it's common sense. I have come up with no fewer than 14 ways that reproduction, sexual attraction, family, whatever leg of the stool you want to focus on, I think all of them are conspiring to pressure it. And I would love to get your thoughts on some of these. You've already talked about porn and the advent of sex robots, which, is so free and easy and everybody's so hot and everything feels so good, when you are in control of it yourself, that, this whole idea of having free and available broadband porn of any kind of woman you want and being able to shift literally from one woman to the next on a whim has almost made having real life sex obsolete. Now, I would argue that there's a big difference between getting one's rocks off and intimacy. And I think that's the tragic collateral damage here. But again, that's probably another show, right? You talked about the sexual revolution. I mean, you can get the milk without buying the cow nowadays. You talked about COVID briefly. Man, we've had a whole year where we're not even allowed to see each other's faces in public, let alone hang out with each other. You're supposed to quarantine, and we're not seeing each other. And we're forgetting how to be social, by the way, and we've talked about that. You talked about secular humanist culture, not by name, but, you talked about the idea of free love. And, there aren't a whole lot of mores surrounding just going around screwing like rabbits anymore. So it's really kind of cheap. And other things that I would add that we haven't perhaps talked about yet are the advent of easy, cheap, effective birth control. I mean, if you don't want to have babies, you don't have to. The prolonging of adolescence through advanced education and keeping kids out of the workforce. Therefore, they can't afford to be a family man or have a family or start a family, have kids. Who can afford it when you don't even have a job yet? And indeed, when kids get out of school with a whole lot of debt, you talked about the way university educations are changing. First of all, one of the things to consider there is that it's gotten a whole lot more expensive and kids have to pay it back. Rising costs of life in general, keeps us from feeling like we can afford kids. You talked about, to some degree, the denormalization of heterosexuality. I mean, if you don't want to be heterosexual anymore, you can be gay, you can be bi, you can be LGBTQIA. And I think it's wonderful that society has stopped vilifying each other for differences in sexual orientation. But man, it all happens so fast. Like, I was listening to something from about 13 years ago, and they made fun of gay people freely. And then all of a sudden, about 9 years ago, that was completely verboten. It just seems like that changed almost overnight. Discord sown between men and women, even through mainstream dating advice. All men are jerks. They only want one thing. Now you have also what you referred to briefly again, the incel movement, guys who are involuntarily celibate and they're upset about it. And that's given way to the hashtag men going their own way, who think women are all selfish and they're just going to trade up for a taller, richer guy. And, it becomes a bunch of echo chambers where everybody's decided it's normal, not even the new normal, but perfectly normal for lots of years now to just hate on the other gender we're supposed to be in partnership with. You talked about trivialization, vilification, or even flat out denial of masculinity and femininity. Sexual polarity itself as a social construct. I mean, what are masculinity and femininity? They're just a way to keep women down, the patriarchy, not the actual catalyst of sexual polarity themselves. Abortion. If you don't want to have this baby, even after the birth control didn't do its job or wasn't there to begin with, you can get rid of that baby. And that cheapened children, in my opinion. In general, it cheapened family life in general. And other little things like there's no need to have children as farm workers anymore. You don't need a family of 10. Even if 5 of them get culled by disease or whatever back in the old days, which of course was tragic, because you just don't need them in the fields to work. And then you got divorce stats, which makes everybody scared to death. I mean, I don't want to lose half of my personal wealth and my net worth because I got married to some chick I should never have been married to begin with. All of these pressures, almost none of them were here 70, 80 years ago, Scott. Yet they're now all here in full force. It's crazy, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, what it does is it shows that we can't take for granted many of the things that we used to take for granted. Now, I'm going to talk like a snob here for a second, but I promise it has a payoff.
Okay, sure.
And the snob thing is that, that marriage used to be an institution. And what I mean by that is it just used to buckle things together, used to make things stick together, like sex, procreation, and marriage.
It used to make sense.
Yeah. And many of the things that you just talked about are really about things that like unbuckle those things, that make marriage less of an institution, less of a norm. So for instance, contraception gets in between sex and procreation. Celebrating alternative lifestyles gets in between sex and procreation. Having alternative forms of marriage, that is cohabitation being treated equally to marriage, gets in between sex, procreation on the one hand and marriage on the other. And, so the story, I would say, of our lives, I'm 50, the story of our lives is the unbuckling of things that used to be buckled together. And that makes marriage less of an institution. Now, the great irony is that among the upper classes in America, marriage is pretty healthy. That is, divorce rates are where they are now, where they were in 1980. About 85% of kids who are born in the upper classes, the upper 20% of America, will live their whole life as children with their biological parents. 85%. That number was 95%, in 1960. I mean, it's declined 10%, but here's the kicker. Among the lower class in 1960, the number was exactly the same as the upper class, 95%. Now that number is 30%. That is, the lower classes, anyone in the lower 80% of America, has really borne the brunt of this unbuckling of sex, marriage, and procreation and family life. And so when you drive through urban, the south side of Chicago, when you drive through the rural parts of Idaho where I live, you see very few people who can learn to live together, who have the character, who have the economic prospects for the kind of sacrificial life that will be marriage. So in a very strange way, marriage has reinforced the class divide in America. The ruling elite don't practice what they preach. They practice a kind of quasi-conservative family life, but they don't set an example or try to impose social roles on anyone underneath them. And that's led to kind of the degradation of life for children all across America, especially in rural and urban areas. So, all the examples of things you just gave there, Scott, are really examples of the unbuckling of sex, procreation, and marriage. And the downstream effect of that is really seen in rural and urban America, I think. It's made us two Americas in a way that makes it kind of difficult to sew it back together.
Yeah, I agree with you 1,000%. That's incredibly intuitive. And as you were talking, I thought of yet another one, and that's the rise of me first culture. I mean, sacrifice for family, for your kids, for even the community used to be a no-brainer just about everywhere. But nowadays we've become very selfish, and the term narcissism is bandied about like it's commonplace, either correctly or incorrectly. But the whole idea of being self-serving kind of has become the new God. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, my take on that is that, I think that the old social roles of men and women, mothers, homemakers, men as providers, really helped limit our self-absorption. It pointed us beyond ourselves toward a community, toward something fulfilling that we'll build in our lives that's not easy to build over the course of our life. And when you explode those social roles, you're thrown back on yourself. And so I think the me first culture is as much of an effect of destroying family roles and family ideals as it is a cause of it. I talk about this in my book a little bit, but the idea that men who provide for a family are really tyrants who are trying to lord it over their wives and try to get their way. I mean, that's what feminists say about men who want to provide for their family. It's just that's the most loving expression of male responsibility that there is in life, or one of the most. I mean, there's also sacrifice for the country and sacrifice for public order and things, but it's one of the things that's available to most men, but it's a stigmatized role. And very few people actually say that they want a provider as a husband. But that's actually one of the things that really gives direction and meaning to a man's life. So the destruction of that role, I think, has led to more self-absorption and also, kind of meaningless lives for a lot of men because they don't have any place to point their ambition.
Yeah, that being a provider, as we've talked about time and again on this show, is also one of the primal catalysts for sexual attraction of femininity on the part of masculinity. I'll tell you what, Scott, such a powerful group of thoughts, and I'd never really thought about the idea of the me first culture being an effect of the disintegration of family, but I sense that you're right on about that. And by way of closing this show, I have a couple quick questions for you. First of all, you have a section of your book called The New Problem with No Name that I find fascinating and intriguing. What is the new problem with no name?
Yeah, so Betty Friedan wrote a book in 1963 called The Feminine Mystique. And the feminine mystique was based on this idea, the problem with no name. And the problem with no name then, it was a problem that sociologists and psychologists and doctors were not identifying. For her, it was the idea that women were dissatisfied living in the home. And in fact, they were taking drugs, they were suffering from mental diseases, all because they were in the home. So there was this problem, but it hadn't been given a name. And I thought I would kind of use her phrase, the problem with no name, in my book. And the problem with no name that I use in my book is the decline of marital character. And what that means is that we no longer really prepare men and women to live together in a family. It comes out in a lot of different ways in the upper classes insofar as we have this problem. It's emphasizing career over the home for women and destroying the idea that men should be providers among men. But really, this problem also affects the lower classes because the men don't rise to the level of being able to be responsible, to own their future, and live family life. And women assert their own independence, but aren't ready for family life. So the new problem with no name, the one that no one talks about, but is really at the root of our problems, is the decline of characters that can be trusting and sacrificing for a family in both men and women, though it comes out differently in men and women.
Yeah, just a cheapening of character, purpose, faith and belief, relationship, and responsibility. It just seems like everything's become cheap when everything's become automated and, life itself is even cheapened. Fascinating. What would you say to men, Scott, who are scared to death to become husbands, let alone fathers? I mean, I know I've been there. Part of that is kind of normal butterflies, but I mean, there's guys who are swearing it off. What do you say to those guys?
Well, I would ask you to think about what life is going to be like when you're 70. Now, marriage is a risk. And, women are less stable than they used to be, and men are less stable than they used to be. And, it really is a decision that you make to just stick together over the course of time. But what is life going to be like when you're 70? Are you going to be surrounded by people who you have given something to and risked for? or are you going to be alone? I have been around grandparents when they die and they've been surrounded by family. And I can't imagine what it would be like to be, childless, spouseless, and facing the end of your life and looking back and asking what you've accomplished over the course of it. And I think really one of the great accomplishments that's available to most people is a risk, but it's getting married and having children and raising them to honorable adulthood. It's hard. There's a lot of obstacles to it. It's a great challenge to your character, your patience, your intelligence, your judgment. But, it's one of the only things that unites us across generations and is worth the great sacrifice that we put in for it. I've done all these crazy things over the course of my life. I've had 5 kids, and I've gone to Portland for basketball games, and I've gone to Las Vegas for basketball games, and I've gone on hikes with my kids, and none of these things are strictly speaking productive. They don't make me richer in a material sense, but they're going to be the things that I think make me happy as I age and as I continue to have those great relationships. So I think they're unreplaceable relationships and worth the risk.
I'm reminded of one of the most poignant points you made during your interview that I heard that introduced me to your work, which is, they do these, I don't know, I guess you call them surveys or polls of younger people who say, I don't want to get married. I certainly don't want any kids. It's too burdensome. I want to live a freer life. I don't have time for that. I don't want that in my life. And then almost invariably, as we hit age 45, age 50, we wish we did have kids. We wish we did have a family. But by then it's too late for most, right? It's very, very poignant indeed.
Yeah, I mean, that seems to be kind of our future. It looks like it's going to be about 40% of the people in the current Generation Z, I think. Is that what they're called? The people who have been born after 2000 are going to end up childless if current trends continue. And, I just think that that's going to be a recipe for very unhappy older people. And it's going to cause great problems for us as a society to try to figure out not just the technical things about how to care for them, but really also how to deal with their disappointments. I'm thankful I won't be in that position. And I pray that many of you won't be in that position, because it's just one of the things that gives life meaning. There are other things that give life meaning. You can pursue wisdom. You can have great artistic accomplishments. You can build a business. You can, live a life of piety. All of these things are within the reach of many people. But, marriage and family life is also within the reach of many people. It checks a lot of boxes and on the road to happiness.
Yeah, Scott, like you, I'm grateful I got over myself, and we're on kid number 4 now.
Oh, good. Well, that's a good start. Good start.
Yeah, I got 4 years on you. I'm 54, and I got a 9-year-old daughter, and boy, she keeps me young, chasing her up and down the hills in the neighborhood on bicycles, for sure. Good stuff. We wouldn't trade her for the world. His name is Scott Yenor, and he is from Boise State University. He's also a Washington Fellow at the Claremont Institute. The name of his book is The Recovery of Family Life, Exposing the Limits of Modern Ideologies. And when you go to mountaintoppodcast.com/Amazon, you will see Scott Yenor's book right there at the top of the queue on my Amazon influencer page. And I also invite you to go to mountaintoppodcast.com/Yenor, and that's YENOR. It's like tenor or senior, if you will, only with a Y on the front. And there you'll be able to get a copy of Scott Yenor's book as well. Scott, thank you so much for this long overdue conversation. I mean, it's been so long in the making, and man, I think you pretty much hit it out of the park. Thanks again.
Thanks for having me on, Scott. I appreciate it.
Yeah, guys. And if you haven't visited mountaintoppodcast.com just yet, be sure to head there, click on the button in the upper right-hand corner, talk to me about, hey, how you can get a real, actual red-blooded woman in your life, not some robot, right? And also how we can make sure you're the right man to get the right woman in your life. It's all about identity and purpose first, and then that way, when you know who you are, you know who to attract in your life. And I can also give you the skills, empower you to be able to do that. That and so much more is there for you at mountaintoppodcast.com, along with our 2 sponsors, Origin in Maine and Hero Soap. You can visit both of those sites with links that are conveniently there for you on mountaintoppodcast.com. And when you do business with either of those fine organizations, please use Mountain10 as your coupon code. And with that, until I talk to you again real soon on the next episode of the Mountaintop Podcast, this is Scott McKay from X and Y Communications in San Antonio, Texas. Be good out there.
The Mountaintop Podcast is produced by X and Y Communications. All rights reserved worldwide. Be sure to visit www.mountaintoppodcast.com for show notes. And while you're there, sign up for the free X and Y Communications newsletter for men. This is Ed Roy Odom speaking for the Mountaintop Podcast.